Whatever happened to the ending of the Gospel of Mark? Did Mark write the ending? Should we accept it as inspired? Well, in this video, we're going to take a quick look and think through some of these issues. Hi, I'm Daryl Burling from Master New Testament Greek, here to help you with the tools, habits, and systems to master the Greek of the New Testament. If that sounds interesting to you, go ahead and hit the subscribe button and then hit the notify bell so you're notified when new videos are released. So the Gospel of Mark, did you know that there are actually 5 known endings for the Gospel of Mark? 5 endings. Whoever would have guessed it? So anyway, 3 of them are regarded as scribal additions. And so these 3 are, first of all, there is a shorter ending, which is widely regarded as, much later than the Gospels being written, and therefore it's not accepted as, inspired in any respect. There is also a number of manuscripts that have the shorter ending followed by the longer ending, the ending that we have in our Bibles. And so this is regarded as another ending in and of itself. This is also regarded as not being the original text of Mark's Gospel at the end. And then, of course, there's a third option here, which is not regarded as original, which is the longer ending plus what's called a logion, a saying of Jesus. So these are the 3 that are regarded generally by scholars as being scribal additions. That leaves us with 2 primary options for how the Gospel of Mark ended. One of those, of course, is the longer ending. That is the ending that you and I have in our Greek New Testaments or even in our English New Testaments today. This is called the traditional ending. Now, this ending is accompanied by, of course, the shortest ending, which is no ending. Now, Mark seems to have ended his Gospel at verse 8. So this is really regarded as one of the other 2 options for the actual ending of the Gospel of Mark. And so when you get to this discussion, often the discussion is, should we accept the ending or should we not accept the ending? And if we don't accept the ending, then we just regard the ending of the Gospel as being in 16 verse 8. So these are your primary options. And so in this video, we're going to look at the longer ending and the shorter ending and just talk about those primarily because the other 3 endings really are regarded as scribal additions and aren't really considered to be legitimate endings. So first of all, why is it that scholars reject? And what I should mention here is that most scholars today do actually reject the longer ending of the Gospel of Mark. And we'll nuance that in just a moment. But here's what they tend to say. First of all, there's manuscript evidence against the longer ending being a legitimate, inspired ending for the Gospel of Mark. So manuscript evidence. First of all, even though the vast majority of manuscripts out there do have the longer ending in them, in fact, there are only really 2 early manuscripts that don't have this ending, but they are important manuscripts, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus. Now, these manuscripts they both have a space in them where the longer ending could have been added. But for whatever reason, those endings are not included in these 2 codexes, in these 2 manuscript documents. And so because these 2 leave it out, and these 2 are generally regarded as pretty reliable early witnesses, these suggest that the original texts did not include the longer ending in it. Well, what about the earliest texts of Mark's Gospels? Don't they have this ending in them, or do they not have the ending? Well, the earliest text we have today of the Gospel of Mark is P45, which actually has none of chapter 16 at all in it. So it's inconclusive. We don't know whether the ending was there or not because the whole chapter's missing. And so P45 lacks it, so we don't have any evidence that predates these texts in terms of the weightiness anyway. So the other thing here to bear in mind is that there is not a lot of early works and early authors who refer to these documents, specifically Eusebius and Jerome. Both of these men, who are regarded as being pretty astute when it comes to early texts of the Greek texts, they both note that the majority of manuscripts, early manuscripts that they're aware of, do not have this longer ending in it. Some have suggested that Eusebius was commissioned by Constantine to actually record and collate the text for Sinaiticus. And if that's the case, then the fact that he did not include the ending in Sinaiticus is perhaps suggestive. However, there are, of course, others. So, for instance, Origen and Cyril of Jerusalem and a number of others don't refer to this text at all, this longer ending that is. Now, on top of this, and this goes back to the manuscript evidence as well, the fact that it's missing from Sinaiticus and Vaticanus is significant because it's more likely that a scribe would maintain this text if it was in the original documents and it was passed down to them. They'd be very unlikely to omit this text when they're copying one manuscript to another. So copyists are more likely to add a text than they are to delete it. And so the argument is that's what's more likely to have taken place, and therefore that's likely to be the explanation here. There's another reason, and this is probably the biggest reason that scholars reject the longer ending, is that it was probably, very likely, not written by Mark. In fact, we're almost at this point where there's almost unanimous agreement amongst Greek New Testament scholars that this longer ending of the Gospel of Mark was not penned by Mark. And this is itself a reason to consider not including it in the canon. Now, what are the reasons behind why this was not written by Mark? Well, first of all, there are vocabulary differences. There are a number of words in this small text that don't occur anywhere else in the Gospel of Mark. The author of this text had perhaps a slightly different vocabulary to the rest of the Gospel. Now, this is kind of, there's some truth in this, but it's probably more the kind of words that are included in this text rather than the actual number of them. Because whenever you go through any text in the Gospel of Mark, for instance, the last 2 chapters, or even the last chapter, is going to have words in it that haven't occurred throughout the rest of the Gospel of Mark, yet we don't disagree that that was written by Mark as well. So anyway, vocabulary differences is one reason, but also there are style differences. Mark uses a number of literary devices throughout the Gospel that he does not use in this ending, and there are stylistic differences in this ending that we don't see in the Gospel of Mark as well. And thirdly, there are theological differences between what we see in the longer ending and what we see in the rest of Mark's Gospel as well. So these are all internal evidences that suggest that Mark didn't write this text, and because it wasn't written by Mark, scholars argue that it shouldn't be considered canonical. Now, there are, of course, reasons to accept the longer reading. So, what are they? Well, first of all, scholars argue that it's unlikely that a book would be ended with the conjunction gar. Now, gar means for, and it is a post-positive conjunction, which means it comes after typically in the first 1 or 2 words after the words that start a sentence. So in this case, it starts off the last sentence of the Gospel of Mark, if it ends in chapter 16, verse 8, is for they were afraid. Now in English, for comes before they were afraid. But in Greek, the word they were afraid comes before for. And so we translate it properly so that it works in English. But the word gar, for, comes last in the Gospel account. And scholars argue that, well, this is unusual or unheard of for a book from this age. Now, the argument back is that no, actually, we do have examples where books have ended with the word gar in Koine times and before. In fact, Plato actually ends one of his works with the word gar as the last word of a book. So there is some arguments pro and con with this particular one. But this is one of the arguments for accepting the longer reading. This is not where Mark intended to finish. Secondly, it has strong manuscript support, and this is good evidence. There is a lot of manuscripts that do have this text appended to the Gospel of Mark. In fact, there are only those 2 that I mentioned that we know of that don't have it. This gospel, or the ending of this gospel, is referred to by people within the 2nd century, such as Justin Martyr and others. And so, this suggests that because this ending was written maybe in the first couple of decades of the 2nd century, that these people regarded it as inspired and cited it and quoted from it accordingly. And so this is another reason for accepting the longer ending too, because there are a number of people in the early church who regarded it as inspired. Fourthly, the existence of the alternate ending suggests that scribes were not happy with 16 verse 8 as an ending. Okay, that's legitimate. However, the problem with this is that we don't really argue that scribes were inspired. The original authors were inspired, but not necessarily the original scribe. And so scribes, This argument really comes from places like Romans, where Tertius, who's functioning as the scribe for Paul, greets the people who the letter is written to at the end of the book of Romans. And so if he could do that there, well, why couldn't another scribe do that here with the Gospel of Mark? So this is really an argument for, scribal inspiration, if you want to put it that way. And then finally, one of the important things that you have in Mark's gospel is that Mark, when he records one of Jesus' prophecies, he always records also the fulfillment of that prophecy, with one exception, and that is with the resurrection and appearance of Jesus in Galilee with the disciples. And we have two references in the Gospel of Mark to Jesus saying that he will meet with the disciples in Galilee after his resurrection in 14:28 and 16 verse 7. But these are not fulfilled in Mark's gospel, but they are fulfilled in this longer reading. So this is perhaps the best reason to accept the longer reading as being inspired, because it fulfills that requirement that Mark sets in his gospel. So those are the reasons for accepting the longer ending. So that leaves us really with three options for the Gospel of Mark. First of all, we can say the ending is from Mark's hand and therefore it is inspired. Now, not very many scholars today accept this position. Very few would agree that this is actually written by Mark for the reasons I gave a moment ago. So that leaves us with two options. It is not from Mark's hand and therefore it should be discarded. Or it's not from Mark's hand, but it should be regarded as inspired anyway, for perhaps the reasons like scribal additions being inspired. So those are your options. So let's ask the question then, well, what happened to the original ending? Well, there are three options, really. It was lost. Now, you'll know, of course, that the end of scrolls are the most susceptible to damage, right? So from mildew, from, just wear and tear, those kind of things, because the end of the scroll tends to be the piece of the scroll that gets exposed. So some people suggest that maybe this piece of the scroll was actually lost. Others argue that it was intentionally removed. And the third one is that simply Mark was not able to complete his work. Maybe persecution broke out in Rome where he was writing it and he was forced to put the scroll into the hands of people who were leaving Rome in order to keep it safe. Or perhaps he was martyred before he could get to the ending. Or perhaps it was something else happened. Maybe he ran out of paper or ran out of ink or something else. So who knows? So these are the three options for what happened to the original ending of the Gospel of Mark if Mark didn't write it. Let's conclude this and talk about our options. First of all, what we do agree on is that Mark 16 verse 8 is the oldest and the most reliable ending of the Gospel of Mark we have. We know that Mark wrote this ending. It's in the earliest manuscripts. It's in the best manuscripts. It's universally attested to being from Mark's hand. So that is well affirmed. Scholars generally agree too that the longer ending was not penned by Mark originally. So again, that leaves us with those two options. Is it not penned by Mark but inspired, or not penned by Mark and not inspired? Those are your options. And there is reason to both accept the longer reading and there are reasons to reject the longer reading. And so we have to make a decision. Now, scholarly consensus, and this is kind of interesting, over the 20th century, scholarly consensus has gone backwards and forwards between accepting 16 verse 8 as the intended ending or accepting 16 verse 8 as an unintended ending. Okay, so in the first half of the 20th century, scholars believed that Mark wanted to continue writing, but for whatever reason, he was not able to continue. So in the second half of the 20th century, scholars started to argue that no, actually Mark intended to finish at 16 verse 8. And there are a variety of reasons for why he didn't continue the gospel and finish it as he wanted to finish it. However, scholarly consensus has gone backwards and forwards on whether 16:8 was the intended reading or not. And more recently, we've had a number of commentaries that have been released that suggest that maybe Mark didn't intend to finish at 16 verse 8 and did intend to write something else afterwards as well. But one thing is for sure, the debate for this will go on for quite some time. But let me ask you, what do you think? When you read the Gospel of Mark and you look at the ending of the Gospel of Mark, do you regard the ending of the Gospel of Mark as inspired, or do you regard it as uninspired? Do you believe that Mark wrote it, or do you believe that it was a scribal addition? Leave your comments in the comment section below and let me know, and I'd love to interact with you there and hear your views as well. If this has been helpful, this is the kind of thing I do pretty much every week. You can go ahead and hit the subscribe button and then hit the notify bell, and you'll find out when new videos like this are released. And if you're interested in learning more about how to read the Greek of the New Testament, then go to masterntgreek.com/roadmap and download my free roadmap to take you from wherever you are right now, beginner or never having touched Greek, or maybe you've been doing it for a few years, all the way to reading the New Testament in the original language fluently. So I hope this has been helpful. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Until then, take small, consistent steps toward mastery, and it will be inevitable. I'll see you in the next video.